Local lockdowns are meant to be a way to contain infection, but maintain as much economic activity as possible. Well, what's the effect if the area that you're in is not locked down, but the area next door is? Gabriele, welcome.
Hello, Tim.
And Todor, welcome as well.
Hello, Tim, and thanks for having us.
Now, lockdowns, optimally, I guess, they try to balance the need to not spread COVID-19 with the need to carry on at least some economic activity. If they work well, how do they work?
Well, governments should try to strike this balance, but this is clearly not easy. And researchers suggested that the optimal lockdown should be as localized as possible. For example, epidemiologists should suggest you that you should target individual outbreaks. While instead economists will tell you that you should target economic activity. But both agree that you should go as local as possible. So, for example, you will wish to block a large city, which can be, let's say, the center of a COVID outbreak, and do not close other areas which instead are experiencing much less COVID cases at the same time. However, this can be problematic in the sense that lockdowns not have only a local effect, but may also have a further economic effect on neighboring areas, since all the economy is interconnected across space, and it doesn't really follow administrative borders.
Yes, what is the process by which we get these spillovers? How does it happen?
Well, people move around a lot for a number of reasons. For example, most of us commute to work, at least a little bit, but some people even across very long distances. And during the weekend, we may just decide to break out from the city and go in the countryside or to the seaside. And when we do this, we bring money we earned in a place to another geographical location. And local businesses thrive due to this money. But now, if you think about imposing a stay-at-home orders, consumers are unlikely to be able to keep on moving around. They will not bring money anymore in the places they used to go. Or, for example, if some workers are laid off due to the lockdowns, they may cut on their expenditure in the place where they live, which is not necessarily the one they're working.
In your research to measure these spillovers, you have to capture the way in which people move between lockdown and not lockdown areas. How do you do that? What data can you use to do that?
So in our paper, we use three main sources of data. So first, we measure commuting using the ACS survey data, which measures commuting from 2011-2015. And so we use that as kind of a proxy measure for current commuting. Then for consumption, we use geolocated data, where essentially we use data that was gathered from people's smartphones, and then it was matched to the geographical boundaries of businesses. And so that allows us to know which businesses were visited from people and where these people came from. And the final piece of data is obviously the data on travel restrictions. And so that we measure that using we use as basis the NYT database of travel restrictions, and then we supplement that with data that we collect ourselves. And then we cross-check that data with other data sources.
I see in the paper you've got this down at a sort of county by county level. How many people before these local lockdowns came in, how many people were crossing county lines on a daily basis?
So the ACS tells us that this is about a quarter of people commute for work across county boundaries. Now, obviously, this is kind of unequally distributed. So this is mainly flows from suburbs to kind of big urban centers. But also, I mean, there is also the case where restaurant, for example, more than a third of people that go to restaurants actually come from outside the county of the restaurant.
Now, looking at these spillover effects on employment, are we talking about the people, the jobs of people who travel to a lockdown location to work, and so their work might not exist for some time? Or are we talking about the jobs of the people who are in non-lockdown locations, but whose business is affected because they're not getting the people coming in from places that are locked down?
Well, we actually do both of them. One thing you can think about is how local employment spikes up after a neighboring county closes down and goes into lockdown. And as you said, this is kind of mechanical because some of these jobs do not exist anymore. And since you do not need to live in the same place where you work, it means that you're going to be accounted as unemployed in other locations. And what we do is to say, yes, if we want to account for how much unemployment increases, we need to account for, to predict how much unemployment increases, we need to account for how likely people are to be fired when a neighbor goes into lockdown. But this is not the whole story because, as I said before, consumers may stop coming in counties where businesses are still open, and the people who have been fired and now are unemployed may stop consuming locally. So this means that there are further effects on unemployment, and we see that businesses in areas which are in counties which are still open lose additional jobs, which suggests that areas which were not intended to be affected or targeted by lockdowns are instead actually suffering the effect of neighbors' decisions or national decisions which actually affect only a neighbor. And the interesting thing here is that we look at shop level data using the mobility data, and since we know where the clients of each single restaurant or non-essential retail shop come from, we are able to understand how businesses which have different types of clients, for example, those which come from the same location against those which come from lockdown areas, suffer different losses in employment.
So how big are those losses then when you put them all together?
Well, it's around 10 to 15%, according to our estimate, of the total losses in US employment. For example, in April 2020, at the peak of the pandemic. And if you think that 10% is small, actually it is translated into 2 to 3 million jobs, because in April, more than 20 million jobs were lost in the US. And this is also more likely to be a sort of lower bound than an upper bound of the estimate, due to the nature of the data, which not being perfect is likely to introduce some noise in our estimate. So probably it's even more than 2 or 3 millions.
These are really big numbers, as you say, but yet you don't hear them talked about when people discuss the impact of local lockdowns. In fact, local lockdowns are often presented as a job-saving matter. Should we be talking about them more?
Yes, definitely. I mean, as you said, these are first big numbers, and then we can do a split between, say, how things are and then how things should be, right? So in our paper, we talk, obviously we're economists, so we talk about how things are, and we see that there are indeed effects. And so these are big effects. And so if we say, okay, we compensate people who suffered from the effects of lockdowns and businesses, then clearly, people who are not in the geographical areas that are, formally affected by lockdowns still suffer the effects of lockdown, so they should be compensated. Now, obviously, then we go into the realm of what should be, so that's more of a philosophical question and a political question. And then, if we decide, for example, that we care about fairness, then clearly we should, compensate people as well. So, I mean, the parallel that I can draw, for example, is that here, I'm in France currently. So here, we just had another lockdown, announced. It actually started 2 days ago. And there's a big question about which goods are essential, and whether shops that sell both essential and non-essential goods should actually, stop selling non-essential goods, since otherwise, it would be unfair to shops that sell only non-essential goods. So and then obviously, people in jurisdictions where the decision actually about lockdowns is done at the local level. So, for example, in the U.S., those people should also take into account the effects of their decisions on the geographical areas that surround their local area.
So, as you said at the beginning, local lockdowns look like a go-to policy now for dealing with these sort of pandemic outbreaks in future, and we can reasonably assume that there will be more pandemic outbreaks in future as well. So it sounds like you're saying that policy should be explicitly designed to take into account these external effects.
Yes, it should theoretically. However, it can be difficult for a number of reasons. So first, why it should be designed? Well, just think about two pubs, which may be close to each other and direct competitors, but may just sit across an administrative border. And as I said before, administrative borders are not designed to take into account the economic interconnections of local geographies, nor the pandemic ones, but are just due to historical reasons. Now, if you think about the fact that two pubs are apparently different because they sit on two sides of the borders, are actually very similar, then current policies are likely to compensate only the one which is going to be directly closest due to the lockdown, but not the one who is going to see no more clients because if clients reside in the area of lockdown but cannot go anymore. Now, this is just a small example, but this makes you understand that different businesses which are potentially in competition are going to be treated differently if we do not target the policy. Now, however, targeting the policy can be difficult. For example, in order to do our research, we needed access to very detailed data on mobility. And this potentially, if you want to politically justify such targeted policies, which is going to discriminate shops which are apparently similar but different due to how the business develops, then you can think about the fact that you need much more data to be able to justify as a politician and pass such a policy. Potentially, an alternative will be to create a sort of universal compensation. For example, Italy is now going to compensate all businesses who had at least a 30% reduction in revenues. But then you can think that there are going to be other drawbacks in doing this. For example, you can end up giving money to businesses which were actually not affected by the pandemic. So while targeting remains for us economists the optimal way to go, it may not be politically feasible, and politicians should think whether there are more drawbacks or not in not helping the businesses which have been indirectly affected by the lockdowns.
Well, as our understanding of the pandemic and the measures taken to make the pandemic more bearable for people improves, it doesn't make the policy questions any easier, does it? But thank you for your research. It sounds like it's a very important effect that we hadn't realised the full scale of. Todor, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim.
And Gabriele, thank you as well.
Thank you, Tim.
The title of the paper is Do Localised Lockdowns Cause Labour Market Externalities? And the authors are Gabriele Guaitoli and Todor Tochev. It's in COVID Economics 69. Well, thanks for watching. You'll find plenty more new research on the impact of COVID-19 in COVID economics. It's free, open access, and it's at CEPR.org.